Welcome to the Writer Reads Short Stories. This reading is from Harper and the Unicorn and is part 3 of 4. We hit the wall at a quick jog, moving through a curtain of stone like it wasn't there, and continuing down a broad, well-lit corridor. Frankly, I was disappointed. I'd been expecting something more magical. The guards came in behind us, and none of them stopped. I heard another troll roar as the rock parted to let them through, and then I thought I heard something else. What was that? For a second I thought I'd imagined it, but then the elves slid to a halt and pivoted, and this time I did see weapons. Long blades of light, silver shields pulled out of nowhere, armor that grew around them as though it was built of air and light. I found myself dropped and shoved unceremoniously aside. At any other time I might have tried to escape, but not this time. I knew the sound of a silver bugle when I heard one. Even if I couldn't work out why any prince of the She court would be calling on territory that was not his own. They usually preferred diplomacy, and that played out behind a curtain denying human scrutiny. I picked myself up from the floor and moved so that I was behind the lead elf, but where he could see me. I'd been on enough operations to not want to be a casualty of friendly fire, or in this case, well, I wasn't sure what I'd call it, but I didn't want to die by it either. The movement earned me a slight shift of the head, and I knew he was angling his gaze so he could see both me and what lay ahead. Stay! I snorted. Like hell I would. I'm not sure what the reaction would have been if there hadn't been another troll roar, followed by a clash of metal and the sound of cascading stone. And then the bugle rang loud and clear, and hoofbeats rolled down the tunnel like thunder. I didn't know what these guys would do, but I knew how most crooks would react in their situation, and I ducked under the arm that snaked out toward me, slipping out of reach before I could become a bargaining tool. Nice try, sucker. He had no response for that, because the riders kept coming. I moved back so that they could see me past the elves blocking their path. I'd always associated silver bugles with our allies, and I saw no reason to change that now. I could only hope they'd come for the unicorn, too. I wished Dawson hadn't taken my gun. I could really do with a weapon right now, and somehow I doubted the elves would hand me one of the things they'd conjured out of nothing. I figured that whatever was coming, my allies would want to speak to the ruler of the lands they'd just ridden into, or get a hold of him so they had a bargaining point of their own. And that was something I could help with. The horsemen weren't mucking about. I caught a glimpse of troll gore spattered over mounts and riders, and then I caught a high shrieking neigh that did not come from the horses in front. In fact, if I was right, that didn't come from any horse. The neigh came again, a wild ringing bugle that echoed past me, seeking an answer from the tunnel's depths. Oh shit. The unicorn's herd had arrived. I watched the Thorn Elf guards take a stand, saw one turn back as though he'd grab his leader, and then the foremost riders hit, and there was no time to think. The leader had braced up in the center of the tunnel, but he was no longer looking at me. I took a chance and charged, hitting him as hard as I could in the back, driving a foot down on his calf just below the knee. His leg bent under the pressure, but I'd hit too hard and he fell forward. Didn't matter. I rode his fall and landed on his back, feeling the sharp edges of his scaled armor cutting into my knees. After that, it was a matter of hooking my arm around his throat and hanging on. Nice that the shield trapped one of his arms in front and he fought to keep a hold of his sword. Made choking him down that much easier. The sound of battle rang out in front, but so did the thunder of hooves. I looked up. The riders had engaged the bodyguards, slipping from their mounts' backs to take on their foes. Their horses stood where they'd halted, providing a partial barrier to the storm of white galloping through the cliff face in their wake. Again that bone-chilling neigh, and this time an answer from further in. More cries joined the chorus, and I tightened my grip on the elf leader's throat and crouched low over him, relieved when the unicorns parted like a wave around me. You can thank me later, I whispered, putting my mouth close to my captive's ear, because you'd be a smear on the floor without me. He coughed something that didn't sound complimentary, so I tightened my grip. The last of the unicorns thundered past, and I looked up. Most of the bodyguards were down and being secured. Well, that was going to go across like a ton. The elf with the silver bugle dangling around his neck was one I recognized, and I wondered where his girlfriend was, because she was usually right beside him when it came to slaughtering trolls, regardless of how much she hated being betrothed. Funny that. He looked over at me and then registered who I was kneeling on and trying to choke. He had just started toward us when one of the remaining bodyguards saw what I was doing and knocked aside the blade being held at his throat. I heard metal ring against metal, saw the strength of the blow he landed on his captor, and watched as he pivoted and charged in my direction. This was awkward. I crouched lower, hoping he'd miss, but I'd moved too soon and he slammed into my side. I figured it would be better to let go than break my prisoner's neck. Much easier if we had a living leader to do diplomacy with. Can't say hitting the floor with I don't know how many kilos of angry armored elf on top of me was a good thing. But I was a bit too busy dodging fists and trying to keep the roll going in an attempt to end up on top and not underneath to care. I guess it didn't matter what race it was. Nothing pissed a bodyguard off more than seeing his principal having the life choked out of him. I didn't quite make it. Something to do with mass and whatnot. That and the guard had had a lot more practice at dislodging attackers than I had in being bulldozed sideways off someone I was subduing. That was something we hadn't covered in training. Thing was, Leilani hadn't been involved in the first wave of attacks. She'd come in the second, and she was itching for a fight. She must have followed my attacker across the corridor because she swept him off me before he could get a good grip on me. By the time I'd realized she'd saved me, she was busy slamming the guard's head into the floor, so I looked around trying to see what had happened to the elf lord I'd been sitting on. It was almost a relief to see him staggering to his feet, right up until I registered the sound of returning hoofbeats. Last time I checked, unicorns weren't into diplomacy. Vengeance, yes, they had that one down pat, but diplomacy was for the elves. I rolled halfway to my feet and dived, reaching out to wrap my arms around the elf lord's legs and bring him back to the ground. After that, I tried to pull him under me, working my way along his body in the hope I could cover enough of him to protect him from being trampled or gored as the angry beasts made their way past. "Stay down!" I shouted, and could hear the Lord of Winter shouting something in the Fey tongue, but whether it was at the Elf Lord, the unicorns, or me, I couldn't tell. I just wrapped myself around my former captor and hoped it would be enough. It was a relief to hear the first break in the rhythm of the approaching hooves and see the large white form go sailing over me. I think the Thorn Elf understood what was happening at about the same time, because he stopped struggling and went perfectly still in my arms. And we lay like that for several very long heartbeats until the unicorns had passed and I dared untangle myself from around him. This time I wasn't quick enough to move out of reach, and he dragged me in front of himself and put a dagger to my throat before I had time to get clear. I might have thought about calling him ungrateful, but I had other things to worry about. "Nothing personal," he said, and I was very careful to think nothing in reply, to focus all my attention on the elves who'd moved to close the corridor once the unicorns had passed. Across from us, Leilani had secured her prisoner. I rolled my eyes sideways enough to see that she'd shoved the barrel of her gun up under his chin and was dragging him around to where his lord could see him. I wasn't sure how much good that would do the bodyguard, given just how spiteful. The blade of the dagger pressed against my skin, and I remembered that this elf, at least, could hear my thoughts. It wasn't something I could warn anyone about anyway. I have to admit, the Lord of Winter's opening line was a bit of a showstopper. "Lord of Thorns, we come in peace," he said. I stared at him, but he ignored me, focusing all his attention on the elf lord whose domain he'd invaded. I felt the blade press a little harder against my throat, and wondered if elven magic would be enough to patch the kind of hole it would leave, or even if it would be fast enough. But the Lord of Winter wasn't finished. "We thank you for offering the Sashara tribe protection in their time of need, and for their safe return. And thank you also for the return of the unicorn stallion that protects both their tribe and their herd." He stopped, giving the Lord of Thorns time to formulate a response, and I felt the blade ease, and the thin welling of blood it left in its wake. I didn't relax. Now the knife wasn't at my throat, I didn't know where it might end up. Staying very, very still seemed like a good choice. Or at least slightly better than driving an elbow into his armoured midriff. Best not to disrupt the peace talks, right? I felt the elf lord's hand tangle in my hair, did not like the coldness of his voice when he replied. That does not explain why you still hold my guards as prisoners. The Lord of Winter let his lips bend into a smile that was as deliberate as the rest of his carefully choreographed word dance. It seemed the best way to avoid a diplomatic incident. I could feel the tension thrumming through the Lord of Thorns as he considered his response, and I couldn't fault him. If someone had just kicked in the front door of my home, taken my men prisoner, and taken back something I'd wanted to use to turn a profit, I might not have been feeling too charitable either. But if they were also a lot more powerful than I was and were offering peace instead of threatening vengeance for me having taken the disputed property to start with, I might accept it and plan exactly how I might get even later when I had more of an advantage. It was almost a relief when I felt some of the tension leave him, and he pushed me forward, letting go of my hair and letting me stumble toward the Lord of Winter. I regained my balance, straightening up as I kept walking forward, listening as he spoke.